Hello, Michael. Hi, it's such a pleasure to see you. So whilst I'll look forward to my grief massage later tonight, we're going to move straight towards Michael's presentation. And hello, Jacob, he's here as well. Great to see you. So allow me to introduce Michael and Jacob briefly before we go to Michael's talk. Michael Marder is Iker Basque Research Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country in Spain. And he is the author of a book titled Plant Thinking, as well as many other titles which raise ontological and ethical concerns with vegetal life. And in those books, Marder showcases that vegetal existence deconstructs many of the dichotomies of a traditional humanist and anthropocentric worldviews. And really what he does in those writings is bring plants from the margins of philosophy, where they used to reside for the past few hundred or perhaps few thousand years, and to bring them to the very foreground. However, I started with Plant Thinking because it's a book very dear to me. Michael by no means is a philosopher of a vegetal life only. His writings span the fields of ecological theory, phenomenology, political thought, and he's the author of numerous manuscripts, numerous scientific articles and books. And when I say numerous, I really do mean it. I mean, the amount of time it takes me to write an abstract for my next paper or talk, in that amount of time, Michael tend to publish at least one book, but more likely two. So some of his books include Plant Thinking that I mentioned, Phenomena, Critique, Logos, The Philosopher's Plant, Dust, Energy Dreams, Heidegger, Political Categories, Pyropolitics in the World, The Blaze, Dumb Philosophy, Hegel's Energy, and his latest book, Green Mass, presents his engagement with Hildegard's writings, Hildegard of Bingen, and especially her notion of viriditas, the greening green. And unfortunately, I could not get my hands on this book, which has just come out last week, and it's already out of stock on one infamous online shop. However, I do look forward to it magically arriving in my mailbox, hopefully soon. And given that particular book and Michael's interest, we are very, very pleased that we had a chance to have Jacob with us tonight as well, because he, as an ecological thinker, constructive theologian, and theological ethicist, is really in the best position to engage deeply and profoundly with Michael's work. So Dr. Jacob Erickson is assistant professor of Theological Ethics in the School of Religion at Trinity College Dublin. His research engages the disciplines of environmental humanities and eco-theology for the sake of planetary conviviality. And he focuses also on the complex relationships of earth and religious imagination, decolonial environmental ethics and queer theory, as well as classical Christian theologies and contemporary constructive theopoetics. He's currently working on a project on climate ethics under a truly divine title. I'm going to read, A Theopoetics of the Earth, Divinity in the Anthropocene. I really look forward to learning more about this. And he also has a forthcoming book on climate grief and theopoetics. Well, welcome to both of you. We really look forward to your conversation. And I'm going to disappear at this stage.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Aliyah, and thank you for organizing this event together with Nikolai. It's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you and to share the virtual stage with Tim, who I really admire and whose work I find very influential for my own thinking. I think that today, many of the things I'm going to say are going to resonate with what Tim has been saying. There will be some dissonant notes as well that are probably as important, if not more important, than the resonances. And before I begin, I really had to react to this brilliant idea of thinking about lawn mowing as the performance of masculinity. Of course, Tim left it implied, but it seems very clear that it's a very anxious performance of masculinity, barely sublimated, because what it really performs is a castration act, an act of castration that is inflicted onto the grass in the hopes of being spared this very act as well. But there cannot not be a tacit, unconscious identification with that grass that is being castrated. So I'll cut it down, I'll mow it down so that I'm spared. So I think this is very much in the background of the logic that Tim was developing here. What I would like to talk today is the nexus, this connection between the garden and the dump, which is the theme of the conference. And the title of my remarks is Between the Garden and the Dump, the Crux of Our Situation and of that of St. Hildegard von Bingen. Now, as some of you might know, the garden and the dump have been the two poles of my thought in recent years. And it seems at first glance that they have nothing in common, that they are as different from one another as can be. One is the image of salvation, the other of damnation. One affirms life, the other denies it. One lets grow and breathe, the other suffocates growth. But things are not as simple as they seem, and they really rarely are as simple as they seem. If they appear simple, just look again. In some ways, the garden and the dump converge. How so? I will proceed in the reverse order and take up the third point of comparison first, namely letting grow and suffocating growth. The dump also grows haphazardly by accretion, so much so that it comes to supplant the overall growth of everything that used to be gathered under the heading of nature, however much you despise or put out of use that concept. The more of it there is, the more it grows, I mean the dump, of course, mimicking the activity of what the Greeks called physis and the Romans knew as natura, the fewer opportunities for future flourishing and finite growth. The garden also lets things grow on the condition that they do not overgrow its form, not only the form that it has, but the form that the garden actually is. Stressing more the perimeter than the territory it encompasses, garden relates not to what it guards, but to how living beings are guarded there. In a sleight of hand, and we started talking about genealogy of terms in the Q&A of the previous session, in a sleight of hand, the word itself has changed its semantic form by switching from an adjective, which it was in the vulgar Latin expression hortus gardinus, the enclosed garden, to a noun. So gardinus, enclosed, became garden instead of hortus. So the Latin hortus was dropped, and gardinus, which was the noun, the adjective meaning enclosed, was kept as the description of what we call garden in English. In the process, it usurped the positive meaning of the milieu it had previously circumscribed in a merely negative manner. Form became content. The guarding of the garden detains the plants growing there and the small ecosystems that develop around them for the purpose of capturing, securely holding, and finally possessing whatever lies within its confines. And so in the juxtaposition of the garden and the dump, the rigidity of form strangely coincides with the formless, with the amorphous accretion of shreds of materials, ideas, toxins, information, ash, overpowering stimuli, and so much more that contributes to the creation and growth of the dump. Now, our second point of comparison was the affirmation and the denial of life between the garden and the dump. Nothing is clear-cut here either. From the dark side of death, the dump lives for us. It takes over the movement, production, and reproduction of world destruction, wrecking the very being world of the world. And I would add to these lines from my dump philosophy that It forges a kind of life out of the very movement and process of world's devastation and its remainders. The garden, for its part, lets some creatures live by virtue of denying life to others. To ward off external intruders, some gardeners resort to herbicides, insecticides, repellents, and other poisons that Tim has obviously mentioned as well, unleashed as a part of the global toxic flood that we are again living or dying through nowadays. And by we, I mean, of course, not only human beings, but plants and animals and insects and even fungi, because these toxic substances are not differentiating between their targets. They really target everything and everyone in their path. Within the rigid confines of what the garden guards, trying to ensure the purity of the species gathered there, these are the undifferentiated chemical killers that affect, once again, everything and everyone on their path. The stricture of controlled difference, which is the garden, relies on the lethal indifference and non-differentiation for its consolidation. Its guarding is as much a guarding against some lives as it is a guarding for others. Rewilding might go some way toward addressing the problem, but it is not enough. And I must add a footnote here after Tim's talk that actually rewilding might be enough if we do really get away from the subject-object opposition or manage to get rid of that very powerful and problematic opposition. So provided that the subject-object opposition remains in place, rewilding is not enough, and so long as the garden as form, which is always a form of guarding or gardening, endowed with proprietary vigilance, is retained. The practice of rewilding, at least in this active sense, as a practice and not as a letting be that Tim referred to, preserves the illusion that we are powerful enough in our conscious rejection of mastery and dominance to bring back the past of wilderness and to erase a long history of human-plant interactions that have profoundly influenced the two parties to the relation. And now we come to our first point of comparison in this reverse order: salvation and damnation. The strong theological undertones of this formulation are not accidental. The garden, any garden, is always a trace of the Garden of Eden, while the dump is the condition of the fallen world here below, the earth unto which and into which everything falls. Still, the salvific nature of the garden is highly suspect, not least because it is by virtue of Eden being a garden that the expulsion of Adam and Eve is effective. The first woman and the first man were a privileged part of paradise guarded for God's amusement, satisfaction, or some other reason. After the fall, the place they used to belong to is guarded against them. So you see here in this difference between the prelapsarian condition and the expulsion from paradise, you see the difference of guarding for and guarding against that is folded into the very concept of a garden. As for the dump, it is not only the space-time of damnation, but also that of another mode of thinking and being related to mass, and more specifically to biomass. Again, I deal with this concept in dump philosophy, where I write that since scattered ideas are dumped alongside carbon emissions, monocultures, plastic packaging, and parts of mass-produced plants and animals, thinking itself cannot stay far behind the overall thrust of massification. So thinking must join the biomass that life is made into today. Thinking must dedicate or rededicate itself to life and to mass, to life's protracted evanescence in mass, in weight, in a formless mess, in heaviness, density, and gravity. And this indeed is one of the starting points for my engagement with St. Hildegard of Bingen in Green Mass, this book that Aliyah referenced in her introductory remarks. The ambiguity of the title is linked directly to the issue at hand. Green mass refers both to the way plants have been assessed as the heaviest biomass on Earth and to a musical composition in Christian liturgy, which is colored on the model of George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. The most crudely material thing, weight, life reduced to the heaviness of living bodies, hence a dump hinting at the prior movement of dumping, this most crudely material thing, and the spiritual element, church music, these senses converge in the word mass. And I note in passing that words are never just words, that the speculative impulse of thinking and of being, bringing opposites together, makes itself felt with crystal clarity in language. So words are never just words, they're the symptoms of something that is going on here. And mass for me, especially in the title green mass, but also in the word biomass, is a symptom in that sense. To my mind, this coincidence of opposites is one of the signature features of Hildegard's creativity. Now, at the same time, the drama of Hildegard's thought, staged in barely veiled ecological terms, unfolds between, you've guessed it, two poles, which in Latin she calls viriditas and ariditas. Viriditas, which may be translated as the greening green or the green that greens, refers to the self-refreshing power of creation, which is extraordinarily heightened in plants and which allows the infinite shine through the finite. And based on this remark and the critique that was mentioned by Bruno Latour for the greening and the privileging of green in relation to ecological issues, we might say that the green is not only green, it is a synecdoche for life. Obviously, it does not represent all of what is called life, but in its singularity, it condenses the whole. It's synecdochic in that sense. This is viriditas for Hildegard. Ariditas is a deadly force drying up life itself, the main effect of Hildegard's non-moralistic notion of sin. Ariditas hardens the divides between the body and the soul, matter and spirit, the ensouled body and its environment, while depriving life of the conditions necessary for living on. So viriditas foments existence by introducing into it a certain non-identity, a non-self coincidence that gives the existence their future in the shape of an other or of others. Ariditas, conversely, imprisons things, placing them in the straitjacket of their identity. In advance, it transforms every living body into a corpse, and I might add an embalmed corpse at that, not allowed even to decompose. The ecological figurations of viriditas and ariditas are not so much the garden and the dump as the forest and the desert, right? So if I were to translate these theo-environmental poles of Hildegard's thought, viriditas and ariditas, they would not so much translate into the garden and the dump as into the forest and the desert. The forest is the vegetal milieu that is suspended or even disbanded in the garden, which maintains itself as such only in its distance to and difference from the forest. So the garden gives us a trace of the forest while keeping the forest away, right? It is also the figuration of matter that has been inherited by philosophy and theology from the Aristotelian coinage of the concept yle, right? So before the Latin word materia was in use, Aristotle coined a concept, as he did with many other concepts in philosophy, taking a very common Greek word yle, which means wood and the woods. So timber, already dead wood, and the living woods, the forests, and calling this and treating this as what we know as matter. Right? This indeterminacy of the relation between the living and the dead already folded into it, while the singularity of plant life, wood or the woods, being again synecdochic in relation to other types of matter, other kinds of materials. The desert as an ecosystem and the figuration of spirit divorced from matter encroaches in the measure that forests recede. We all know this sad dynamic of deforestation and desertification. Deforestation is desertification in both the physical and the metaphysical senses. Further, the vast emptiness of the desert is formally incompatible with the oversaturation of the dump, and yet the devastation of being, which is more terrible and thoroughgoing than destruction, is responsible for both of these events, both of these trends. The vastness of devastation is at once vacant and full, spacious beyond measure and running out of room, barren and strewn with debris, a desert and a dump. While the garden suppresses and circumscribes the forest within it, the desert and the dump undeniably belong together in their absolute negation of the forest. But let's go back to the Garden of Eden together with Hildegard, if we may, and observe what is going on there in that archetypal garden before the first humans are expelled from it. Immediately, we see that we cannot say with complete certainty that Adam and Eve are really human there. Now, I'm not referring to the history of theology and philosophy, both earlier and later. And I'm thinking here of St. Augustine on the one hand and Hegel on the other, that also subscribe to this view, that keep to the view that the fall is the humanizing factor of the human, the condition of lack and loss, of separation from what is called nature, of knowing that one is mortal, of the awakened conscience and sense of shame. The fall is without doubt a humanizing wound. It's a wound that humanizes, that bestows a human identity. But that is not why Hildegard doubts the humanity of Adam and Eve prior to the fall. According to her, Adam and Eve live in the garden in the manner of plants. Crafted out of the earth, they imbibe from it their viriditas directly, like plants, she implies. After their fall and the expulsion from Eden, the power of viriditas weakens in Adam and Eve, though not in plants, that as a result sustain not only our physical existence, but also spiritual life, all the way down or all the way up, depending on how you see it, to the figuration of divinity. Does the human need a dump to be humanized? Is the act of dumping, of being dumped into the world as into a gigantic wastebasket, does this act render us genuinely human? And by implication, do various fantasies of post-humanity tacitly signal the old yearning for redemption, our redemption not of, but from the human? As you already know, I have my doubts about the possibility and even the desirability of a return to the garden, which on a smaller scale perhaps than the dump, and through different means, subdues life, vegetal and not only. It is necessary to think and to strive toward what is outside the outside space and time that is the garden, to strive toward what is outside the outside of the garden. In this outside of the outside, we may seek the forest, but we encounter the desert, the dump, or in fact both in one, a desert dump. The same happens when we look inward into what used to be called our subjectivity. Nietzsche's Zarathustra was abreast of the situation when he said, "The desert grows, woe to the one who harbors deserts." The desert is not only out there in the deforested world, it is also in here. We harbor deserts in what used to be called our subjectivity, in our psyche. Psychic life is itself desertified. Lest you think that Hildegard was a starry-eyed optimist, consider her description of the world as a shipwrecked world, naufragus mundus, in a hymn to St. Rupert, or her horror at the encroaching desert, breathing with deadly ariditas. Or again, her characterization of the zombie reality she sees all around herself. In chapter 46 of her fifth vision, included in book 2 of Scivias, God decries unbridled human mastery and control over creation. And I think this, I'll cite this part of Hildegard's vision. I think it's extremely important within the history of philosophy and of theology as well, because it goes absolutely against the grain of using the biblical narrative to justify human mastery and dominance over creation. So this is what God says according to Hildegard. I had a green field in my power. Did I, God, give it to you, O human, so that you would make it put forth whatever fruit you wished? In other words, this is the response that Hildegard gives to Tim's critique of the American lawn. Did I give it to you, O human, so that you would make it put forth whatever fruit you wished, which in this case is a complete fruitlessness and the wished kind of uniformity and homogenization of grass. The greenness of the field discussed on these pages from Scivias is outer and inner, that of plants and of the heart of an oblate dedicated and sanctified to Christ in baptism. Having dared rashly touch not so much the green field itself as that which makes it green, having meddled with a power, potestas, that is not theirs, human beings produce a strange effect, according to Hildegard. And again, I quote, a strange effect that is neither dry nor fresh, and a world that is neither dead nor alive, right? Neither dry nor flesh, neither ariditas nor viriditas, and a world that is neither dead nor alive, a zombie world, a zombie reality. Just as an oblate dies to the world while continuing to live in it, so mutatis mutandis, our world dies to us who continue trying to inhabit it and to keep harvesting its late fruit. What does Hildegard do when she faces a zombie world that is neither dead nor alive? Or, to be more precise, what does she undergo in the face of this experience? The answer is that she is seized by mystical visions, among which is the one that reveals the state of the zombie world itself. And she endeavors to heal the world by mending the torn ties between spiritless matter on one hand and matterless spirit on the other. She tries to listen and to contribute to the symphony of creation without deafening herself to the screams, moans, and groans of injustice. Again, think back to the moment in Tim's talk about the scream, right? In other words, Hildegard's mysticism is not escapism from the reality of suffering, say to a garden walled off from the rest of the fallen world, but a conduit for the voicing of this reality. It immerses her in the dump as much as in divine splendor, the dump becoming what it is under the influence of the light and heat of God's justice, of God as justice. Now, in the second vision from Book 1 of Scivias, Hildegard makes this appeal, and I quote again. Hear, therefore, and understand, God, who is the Son of Justice, Sol Justitiae, made his splendor rise over the filth that is man's wickedness, and that splendor shone with great brightness as that filth stank exceedingly. The sun gleamed forth in its brightness. Again, remember, the sun here is the sun of justice, gleamed forth in its brightness, and the filth putrefied in its foulness. And therefore the sun was embraced by those beholding it with much greater love than if the filth had not been there opposite it. Unquote. Unwittingly, perhaps, Hildegard shows how the thermal spiritual force of the sun intensifies and brings into its own human wickedness, contributing to the process of decomposition. Less obviously, she places the stinking filth of this wickedness at the level of the soil, of compost that actually enables future growth. That said, the problem for us, those living, dying nearly 1,000 years after Hildegard, is at least twofold. And I'm drawing to my conclusion here in talking about this twofold problem in the almost 1,000 year span that separates us from Hildegard. First, there is no external sun of ideas, of God, or what have you, to illuminate and to heat up the dump that is outside us and that we harbor within. We must seek orientation from the disorienting dump itself, moving in the dark, a mass among the masses that comprise it. Phenomenological discernment of meaning in the faint light with which the things themselves shimmer is precluded here on a par with a metaphysical source of transcendental meaning. Second, the dump accretes out of things that do not decompose, do not putrefy, and by not decomposing, leave no room and no time for the future. So our problem is the opposite of Hildegard's. She is, after all, finding something positive in the stench of decomposition and this filthiness that is heated by the sun of divine justice, and therefore accentuates the nature of this divine justice even more. But our problem is different, and I think much more serious than this. The filth and the putrefaction brought to light and to a large extent stimulated by the sun of justice or otherwise were the grounds of growth. What comes to a grinding halt, along with the disappearance of the splendor which Hildegard invokes, is the transformation, the metabolism, and the metamorphosis of the world. That is why the worst segments of our dump do not have a nauseating smell. In fact, they do not smell at all and elude all the other senses, right? So for us too, vegetality cannot be only the space-time of reverie, which plants occasioned, for instance, in Rousseau, the solitary walker. Vegetality is not a line of flight from the dump, to use Deleuze's term here. It's not a line of flight from the dump into which it is drawn in the shapeless shape of biomass. With plants, though, we can situate ourselves in the middle, here in the middle of the dump, of dumping and of being dumped together. Just as Hildegard observes in a letter to the Bishop of Bamberg that life is in life, vita est in vita, so we would need to conclude that the dump is in the dump. In Green Mass, I write that the middle is what is most alive in a life, what enlivens the fringes and the extreme edges that are likewise in the middle, no matter how remote from the midpoint. Behind the facade of substantivation, life addresses and sends itself to life in the course of living. Life receives in itself a life that is being lived. Living beings are its messages and messengers, all of them angelic, intermediate, interlaced with one another and with life, from which, in which, and to which they are launched. So today we find ourselves in the middle, perhaps in a different kind of middle, which is in the middle of a dump. And finding ourselves there in that middle is already more than halfway toward the event of the dump flipping back to life, reinitiating the metabolic and metamorphic processes that have stopped. It is here that we can rediscover a sense of the here and that of biomass with which we should identify, rediscovering a sense of the we in it, in this double transformation of bios, of life into mass, and of mass into life. Here, that is not a way station on the path to the ideal over there. Here, and not in the Edenic heritage of gardens that are, more than anything, already the premonitions of a dump. Here, in the crux of our situation, which is also that of Hildegard. Thank you for your attention. And of course, I welcome comments, questions, and the continued conversation on this.
Thank you, Michael, for that. Was so very rich and excellent. And I've been spending time with the book over the last few days, and it is it's a pure delight, actually. So thank you for it, and thanks to the organizers of this conference as well. It's a delight to celebrate students and the work of emerging scholars. So I'm pleased to be with you. It's actually in 2 days' time, it's September 17th. Churches in the higher liturgical and sacramental traditions that of Catholic and Anglican and Lutheran actually do observe the commemoration date of Hildegard of Bingen, sort of now canonized by the Catholic Church as a saint and observed as a teacher of theology by others. And so Hildegard herself stands in this sort of middle space of being both canonized, idyllic kind of teacher, and at the same time, someone for whom their teaching in their own time was observed as an outsider or odd, apocalyptic visionary, sort of exalted. And I was looking through the liturgical instructions for clergy, and of course the vestments and the clerical garbs that's meant to be worn on the 17th is that of a pure white kind of sainthood, the virginal purity of Hildegard. And perhaps what Michael has pointed us towards is that liturgical garb should be a bit of a mix of tan and green simultaneously. I'm delighted by this work and delighted by this offering because of its polyphonous, polydisciplinary possibility for the sake of planetary future. The book that Marder has offered us is a written text and an acoustic text simultaneously, with an accompanying soundtrack, listening to the vast theological acoustics that Hildegard herself offers into the world. And what I appreciate about the ways in which Hildegard is being dealt with is that there is no pretense of trying to return to some sort of pre-modern or anachronistic figure, as if this were a kind of model outside of our ecological crisis, but instead, in fact, a genuine invitation to think with somebody on a kind of path not taken, a path that could have been different. And it's an approach I take myself to my beloved John Scotus Eriugena, who himself sort of talks about Christ as unfolding in the vines and branches in a theophanic, epiphanic world. James Joyce lifts up Eriugena against Aquinas and Finnegan's Wake in a beautiful moment. But this turn to the possibility of a different kind of eco-theological, eco-critical, eco-philosophical, speculative, imaginative possibility, I think, is much of the work that needs to be done. We're not inventing the wheel completely ex nihilo, but in fact, this thinking with possibility is of what's remarkably important for our present moment. At the beginning of Green Mass, and this is the sort of go by the book kind of moment, Michael writes that ever the physician, Hildegard proposes an eco-theological cure to the eco-theological disorder of the rift between matter and spirit, the common dualisms, hierarchical dualisms that are present and pervasive in much of this thought. But I'm really fascinated by this sort of juxtaposition of the eco-theological cure and the eco-theological disorder. That is to say that there's a theological remedy, perhaps, for a theological diagnosis. Hildegard, of course, her being a healer. And I can't help but hear in my own discipline, the religion and ecology, the sort of published 1967 words of Lynn White Jr. in The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, where he gently says that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen, and where most critics will stop there and say, religion bad, theology bad, in the ecological world. He asks for actually the possibility of a religious remedy, a kind of turn to the reinvigoration of sacred groves and the democratic, eco-democratic model of St. Francis. There's all sorts of problems with that article in its historical diagnosis, but I think as a piece that sort of is a genesis for eco-theology itself, it's really beautiful to hear resonances of this reflection on Hildegard as sort of offering that sort of call of Lynn White to say there need to be eco-theological remedies for many of the theological violences that have occurred. And so I'm appreciative of this particular piece because it picks up this sort of polymath of history where the interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity of this mystic comes to the fore. I think I've got a few points that just sort of leap out to me in response here, and they're not necessarily sort of questions or critiques or provocations, but more so if I'm to model Michael's thinking with of Hildegard, I'm going to think with in my own, not line of flight, as you've just cautioned us, but perhaps something a little bit different. Firstly, that I think one of the remarkable things about thinking with Hildegard is her utter, perhaps medieval refusal to think with one singular creation narrative. One of the things that emerges time and time again is her multiple weaving of the priestly narrative in Genesis, that sort of 7-day creation story, the Yahwist narrative with Adam and Eve, Adam, the earth creature from the earth, and Eve, life in sort of ways, and but onwards into ones that are often neglected in other forms of tradition. So the wisdom narratives, and particularly the book of Job. And I think one of the things that this reflection on Hildegard brings out is the ways in which her weavings of these biblical imaginaries, both this idyllic garden, and perhaps even in the priestly account where humans are created to have dominion and subdue the earth, to put the kibosh literally in the text on the earth. And but she places these sort of guardian delight reflections, the letting come forth of the garden of creation, alongside Job over and over again. So Job's exclamation at the end of the book that sort of what's up, and God says, who are you, you sort of small, tiny human, humus of the earth. The exaltation of a kind of anthropology in relationship to ecological life that has been so harmful, and at the same time, the humiliation of it that has its own complex interactions as well, and weaving them together as this sort of complexity of the human in relationship to the rest of our ecological world, which means that she's thinking with a vast array and collage of sources herself, and trying to offer through a kind of more grounded approach. One of the things I want to sort of name and be excessively grateful for is the feminist retrievals of Hildegard in terms of primary text and commentary. Sharon Becher, working with disability and liberation theology, talks about Hildegard's grounding of the spirit, the sort of the dwelling of one further and further into the humus of the earth, precisely as the way that divine wisdom dwells as spirit, Sophia, into the humus of the earth. That could be read, of course, as a sort of a grounding of misogynistic control into a sort of subservient, effeminate sort of response, patriarchally construed. But in fact, Becher notes that it's in fact a kind of taking on of a solidarity of pleasure, such that one realizes where the kind of actual potential for political resistance is. It's precisely in this diving deeper instead of exaltation. And so that anarchy of space that Marder brings up a little bit differently, to use that word, is a powerful tool or a powerful hermeneutic, or the words aren't exactly right. So that's the collage of texts is really important. It is a theology, but I think that collage of texts and that collage of approaches really shows Hildegard's mystical context on one hand, but then also her, in a way, doing a kind of systematically unsystematic theology, sort of fraying between the mapping of doctrinal spaces in some ways, and also constantly undoing them and undoing the sort of patriarchal ways that a kind of theological task is often undone, often done. And she does this through apocalyptic language, yes, and mystical language, yes, and sometimes flirtatious with sort of the speculative intellectual negative theology, yes, but the theopoetic imagery of light and greenness and ariditas working through all of the various. So it's really an eco-theopoetics in my mind. And I think the theopoetic spaces that she constructs serve less as garden-like enclosures of thought, and in fact, more of that complexity and interplay of living and dying, the garden and the dump. So I'm grateful for that sort of lifting up of the theopoetics. It is quite oftentimes in contemporary theology that viriditas is the sole thing that's focused on, particularly in the sense that a greening green is something that is a powerful ecologically and greening figure. And I think the Latour critique, but also brought up by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen in the Prismatic Ecology volume, that I think Hildegard really gives us a kind of collage of colors and light, such that it leads towards the possibility of speculative forms of healing that are both micro-tactics and macro-tactics simultaneously. So I've said quite a bit there, and I don't want to sort of colonize the time either. But I think I don't know if Michael, if you have any responses to any of that, but I'll sort of open up to the questions to see where they are, if anybody has questions as well.
It's just a very brief response. Thank you. Thank you very much for these comments that are really sort of enlightening in respect to Hildegard and her project. And I think you placed you put your finger on something extremely important in the method with which Hildegard proceeds, because she lodges herself within the tradition, and in fact, as you mentioned, within multiple traditions. But from within, she makes them implode very, in a seemingly very innocent way, in a way in which she presented herself in letters written to popes and bishops and archbishops, saying, "But who am I? Just a poor, uneducated, illiterate woman. Who am I to really say this?" And in this very modest, self-effacing way, she places herself, her thought, her visions within multiple traditions, and upends them completely through very subtle gestures, right? So this kind of physicality of elevation that we find in her, specifically in her poetry, when she refers to the Virgin Mary as the greenest branch that carries us all and that elevates us. In this very vegetal, physical way of elevation, again, it becomes unclear whether we're returning to the ground or lifting ourselves up in a spiritual way, not to mention the whole subversion of effeminateness or feminine lack of power, because by associating Mary with the branch that actually carries up and sort of hoists beings up, she associates her with tremendous strength, with vir, that strength that is at the root of both viriditas and even of virginity, as Hildegard reads it. So I would say that she's really a subversive, but in a way that is extremely subtle, and that was a lot of fun to sort of parse out in this small book that I wrote, thinking with her in a sense. Yeah.
I mean, and that's the radicality too, in the sense that she's self-effacing of her own self, but that self-effacement is precisely a self-effacement of the spirit writ large, and so you get a different kind of anarchic kind of God that that's not just about timelessness or something like that, but in fact is precisely, I've returned to my Eriugena again, sort of God is nothing. And that's not a sort of negative theological statement, it's that just God is nothing, precisely, and in a broader way. I'm not sure if I'm seeing any questions coming up in the question and answer box to you. I'm curious how, I mean, if you might reflect a little bit more, you mentioned the language of justice, and is there a kind of politics that emerges from this, not in an instrumental way, but for the contemporary moment that you would drive us toward?
I think that the sort of non-formal political element that emerges from this is a kind of solidarity, because Hildegard, even though she focuses on the symphonic drive, on this sounding width of existences, and not only of different kinds of existences, but even of the body and the mind, right? The way she puts them together is through the symphonicity, and even within what is called the soul, right? This is her famous definition of the soul: symphonialis est anima. The soul itself is symphonic, which means that it's comprised of diverse elements that are somehow sounding together. But and if this is her approach to a project that we might call solidarity, right, and the project of justice, then this symphonicity of existences is not limited only to the euphonic kind of sounding with, but the dissonant notes that I actually started my remarks with are as important or even more important than that. And she doesn't want to forget or to somehow omit all of these cries for justice. Or at some point she talks about the veil of tears that is blinding one as one looks out into the world of injustice. But this veil of tears that presumably distorts our clear vision of the world is the truest kind of vision of the world that is hurt and split and sort of damaged by the work of injustice. So I think that again, in the subtle ways in which Hildegard works, there is a kind of honing of the senses themselves, of aesthesis in its broadest sense, and its training in order not to miss the signals of injustice, and in fact to interpret those as the truest expression of contemporary being, as opposed to the harmonies and sort of idyllic and ideal pictures of the world.
That kind of goes right into Heidi Hart's posted a question that if you might speak more about the musical elements in your book and how they respond to Hildegard. Oh, your volume's muted. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. And of course, I cannot, in speaking about the musical elements, I'll be speaking not only for myself, but especially for the composer with whom I collaborated on this book, Peter Schubach, who is a contemporary Swedish composer and who wrote a work or composed a work titled Green Mass. The musical movements share the titles of the chapters and also resonated to some extent with the themes that are dealt with in the chapters. And by the way, the music itself is completely free for listening to or even downloading on the book's webpage at Stanford University Press. You can find all the musical files there. Of course, given how important music was for Hildegard, it was unthinkable for me to write a book, Green Mass, without the musical element. And of course, for Hildegard herself, music is not only music. This old distinction between instrumental music and the music of the world or the music of the spheres is very important for her. And instrumental music, of course, is important, but only as a trace of this other kind of music that is much greater and that indicates existence itself and the co-sounding of existences, right? This is what it comes down to, really, the expression and what is called symbiosis, what Tim also referred to as symbiosis, is given a very auditory kind of expression in Hildegard. It's the co-sounding of existences, even though, interestingly enough, she obviously had her visions, which emphasize the visual aspect of the sense of ocularity. But the sounding of being is what she focuses on. And I think that it works, these kinds of resonances and co-soundings work at all levels of existence for Hildegard, from the very micro level of the co-sounding of the body and the soul, the different notes, as it were, within the soul itself, to then the resonances among different living bodies and souls, to the kind of ensemble of what is called life through this. Speaking about the actual musical composition, Green Mass, Peter and I had a similar kind of methodological point or relation to Hildegard, that we're not going to try to reconstruct what the true Hildegardian thinking was like, what the true Hildegardian music was like, because of course those notations were produced, the notations that Hildegard herself made, musical notations, at the time when none of the recording technologies for listening to music were available. So it's anyone's guess how even her musical notations could have sounded. And so we started with this kind of impossibility of a reconstruction as a positive condition for thinking with and listening to Hildegard, and also to each other in listening to her. So it's a kind of collaboration that we envisioned that would surpass the relation between philosophy and music, or thinking and sensing, and would even surpass the relation among living collaborators and contemporaries. Our question was, what does it mean to think and to hear and to listen to the world with someone who has been dead literally for 1,000 years, but is perhaps more alive to a certain extent than many of our contemporaries, actually.
Yeah, there's a great it's a Devonder Barnhart song for Hildegard von Bingen, where the song ends up describing Hildegard as a VJ, as a music video DJ, and I think that's sort of the vision and the sonic possibility simultaneously is there. I see Francisca's hand here, and maybe if you want to ask the question yourself. I don't know if I might, or chat. We'll see.
I'm seeing just a few questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
I think maybe we could.
Yeah, let's so Sarah Scaife, I think, forgive my pronunciations of names. If the lawn is a theater of manhood, the garden is a place of protection for women. I'm thinking of virgins sitting with unicorns. Perhaps we can think of the expulsion from Eden as the beginning of patriarchy, a transition from Paleolithic hunter-gathering eco-balance to farming based on rape of the earth. Would Hildegard have a view on this?
Well, this is an interesting take. Of course, in my limited interpretation, I took the view of the garden as a concept or as a form, before we even think what the contents are, as very much aligned with the lawn and with already a very patriarchal, property-oriented kind of relation to the world, where things are delimited, circumscribed in order to claim possession over them. So by virtue of being a garden, the Garden of Eden is already a piece of property of God, right? And then the expulsion has a different, the beginning of patriarchy would be prior to the expulsion from Eden. So I think that in that sense, I'm probably my thinking was very much aligned with Tim's, even though he was talking about the specific example of lawns, and the garden as garden would be already a place of patriarchy, property, possession, domination, and so on.
And the histories of theology that sort of layer on that extra patriarchal sort of interpretations of original sin. And of course, sin isn't in that passage in Genesis at all, and it doesn't even quite emerge until Cain kills Abel, in fact, that sort of patriarchal violence moment, but the garden itself as a sort of structural possibility there. Let's see. No, we may be at close to time here. I don't know if there are any other questions that emerge. Here's Nikolai to come in and save the day.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much, Michael and Jacob. Yeah, we're unfortunately out of time for today, but thank you so much for your talks and your response today here. This was all that we had today for today's program, and of course we'd like to thank you and all the other speakers and respondents who graciously shared your thoughts with us today here. It's been a fascinating series of conversation, I think. All the way from the masculinity of lawn mowing to the mysticism of Hildegard of Bingen. And of course, we'd also like to thank all of you who attended as attendees at the webinar today. We've had more than 150 people joining in at the event, and we of course hope that this will continue tomorrow as the conference continues. If you missed any part of the session today, a recording of the conference in its entirety will also be made available through YouTube after the conference and hosted on the conference website afterwards. Tomorrow's program, which starts off at 12 Central European Time, has plenty of other exciting talks and speakers, including a roundtable discussion with the science fiction writer Chen Qifan. There'll be thesis seminars by Aliyah and I, and then we'll have a number of conference presentations and a literature reading. So we very much hope to see you all there. And apart from that, I guess there's nothing left to say, but thank you for tonight.